everyone. Welcome to and thank you for joining our webinar. We're excited to have you here for our facial authentication security breakthrough or privacy nightmare, where we'll explore the ethical application of facial authentication in enterprise access control and discuss the strategies for deploying it responsibly. And with that, I'll introduce you to Lee, who will be our moderator.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And Peggy, great job on all this and putting it together. Appreciate the opportunity. And also thank you, Michael. Thank you, Sal. And thank you, everybody who's here to really take part in a conversation I think is, I would call it like the beginning of the conversation that we need to continuously have around the topic around ethical biometrics, facial authentication, the rest of it that's going on, because as the industry has shifted and changed, so do are these conversations, and it's going to take things like this in order for us to move them and progress them. We need to agree, disagree, have conversation, and really, do more of this. So, thank you. With that, this is a discussion. You're not going to see a bunch of slides, and it's intended to be somewhat of a guided conversation where we're going to be looking for you to participate. So engage, ask questions, challenge, and let's make this productive. And then my hope is that when it's over, we carry it forward and continue to have that. This was built off of the new white paper that we co-authored with RealSense. It's called The Ethical Application of Facial Authentication in Enterprise Access Control. And I don't want to speak on behalf of Sal, but he actually said it was good. So that's a testament to me that we're doing something right, because Sal and I have a good relationship where he'll tell me if it's not good, which I appreciate as well. So check it out. It's we'll get you where you can download it. Highly recommend it. So real quick, let's do a quick introduction. Michael, if you don't mind, introduce yourself. I call you Michael. It's very formal. But Mike, go ahead, introduce yourself in RealSense if you don't mind.
This is where I say, hey, thanks, Dad. Hey guys, Mike Nielsen. It's been way too long in the security industry. Been around security and identity for a super long time. Like I said, I won't tell you how many years because that'll tell you how old I am. Some years as a CISO, some years on the other side of the fence with physical security and surveillance as well. So joined RealSense a couple of years ago, and we spun out back in July. Thanks again for the opportunity here.
Of course. Sal, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so Sal D'Agostino, IDmachines. I'll follow Mike's path there and say not how long, but it has been a long time doing this stuff. Almost my entire career has been involved with doing identification, automation. I've been using neural nets and all these fun tools for a very long time. IDmachines has been around since 2008. We do a lot of work around standards and best practice, there's a very real overlap with that here today. Let's just get into it. See LinkedIn, Google Sal, whatever you want to do there.
Yeah, he's kind of all over the place, so it's good. So, all right. And then Lee, Access Control Collective, I'll send out information about what we're doing, but we're trying to create conversations like this all over the globe within the security industry. All right, so we're here to discuss, there's a problem statement, right? $1 trillion in losses from physical security incidents in 2022. So you can imagine what it is as we go forward. And what we want to do here is explore how facial authentication can help balance security, privacy, and ethics. So the first thing we're going to talk about is market adoption and comfort with biometrics. So I'm going to kick it off by asking you, Mike. We've seen adoption in phones and in airports, right? That's where we've seen this facial authentication happen. Yeah. Why is the enterprise access control the next step where you believe we're actually going to see it?
So I'm going to take the happy view on things here, and that I think we've all finally become somewhat conditioned to using our faces to get into stuff. I'm now getting it, obviously in airports, it's at SFO at least. At my home airport, 6 weeks ago, I went up to the United counter or on the way into the jet bridge, and somebody said, I guess the facial auth thing isn't working again. They turned the camera, they pointed at the ceiling, they started counting boarding passes again, and the line came to a freezing stop. So, we've seen that when it works and when it's implemented properly and people are participating and cooperating, that things move really quickly, sporting events, stuff like that. So I think that just given all of the behavioral things that have happened on the consumer side of the market, and, hats off to the phone makers for doing this, right? They basically institutionalized it to where everybody uses their face now every single day. But that conditioning is now making its way into the enterprise, and it's a different kind of conditioning where now it's gone from, oh my God, what am I doing with my face thing here, to why am I not using my face for this? So like when you get into an office, when you go into any kind of facility, whatever it happens to be, people just want to do it quickly, and they're conditioned to using their phone to do it, and their phone looks at their face.
Yeah, I do think the impacts of consumerization on this are going to be there. And then actually, it sounds a little bit like, too, there needs to be some change management that has to come into play as well as it gets loaded into like the airport. That's the first thing that jumps out at me with your story around the airport. But Sal,
Yeah,
so
it was a real drag, honestly, because like the line was moving really fast, and suddenly somebody borked it, and then that the United Counter person just gave up, pointed at the ceiling, and said, "Okay, we're going back to scanning passes now."
yeah, sounds about right. So,
Yep.
all right, Sal, how are enterprises approaching biometrics differently from consumer tech? Because there is the need to approach them very different.
Well, yeah, so very carefully, right? Certainly. I mean, just in listening to what Mike was just saying, none of this technology stands on its own, right? So it's something that ends up being integrated, particularly if you're talking about a physical security or access control system. And the industry as a whole doesn't exactly move at light speed. So yeah, how they're approaching it, I think they're approaching it by, in some ways, seeing who goes first, waiting for someone to get a big win. I think that I think you're seeing a lot of it. I mean, I see the industry from a startup and innovation perspective. Companies like RealSense, you're not alone, right? If you look at the number of facial recognition companies that are making readers for getting people into physical spaces, that number is growing is growing certainly. And so, and I think a lot of it's driven by convenience, but at the same time, integrating this and dealing with privacy and other stuff is an issue for people, right? So, and the industry is also driven by cost, right? A lot of this stuff is what's it cost to do this stuff, and there's some very interesting developments around the reduction in cost and the improvements in performance of FR, right? I mean, it is really very good. I mean, when I first started doing this, FR was hard, right? Hard and expensive, and it was generally fast, but now it's fast and relatively inexpensive, and and as Mike said, we use it every day, and then the question comes, why can't I do it with my access control system, as you pointed out, right? So that's a good question to further explore.
I realized I forgot to add an important word, and you just reminded me. It's just trust. People trust the technology now way more than they used to. Before, it was like, this is by definition scary because we all saw Minority Report. But it's a very different world now. And especially, I think all three of us can sit on both sides of this dynamic, where as a security professional, you go, huh. And as a person, you're like, well, why am I not doing it? Right. So I can wear both directions of that hat any given day, depending on how paranoid I feel like being and how much, Sal, to your point, convenience I want to have. Because for me anymore, like if I'm in if you're in a public space, you've given away your right to privacy in the first place, right? You're under surveillance essentially in all public and commercial spaces in some capacity, right? And now, what's cool about the facial auth side of things is that we're not surveilling people. It's you have opted in, you're getting your service and you're doing your thing, but it's that trust in that service, like in trust in my iPhone, or somebody's trust in their getting into, I think, Giant Stadium in New York. So there's a number of these different locations where people have just gotten that level of trust because the convenience is there, and they've gotten past that hump.
I'm going to go off script here for a couple of minutes and just build on that, since we're talking about market adoption and comfort. If I was to ask you currently right now, the current sentiment though, because we're talking North America primarily here and Europe, correct? Right? Like that's I think it's good for us to level set on that side. If I was to ask you, do you believe because take a stat, like 131 million Americans use facial authentication daily. That's a lot of people, right? But if you were to do sort of like a poll of the sentiment within the market, we're talking about comfort, it doesn't feel like you hear it as much as the data and the stats will show it, right? So at what point, because I do inevitably believe this will happen, at what point do you feel the tide shift to where the sentiment matches the execution of what's happening in the market? First, do you agree with me that the sentiment is maybe more, dystopian than utopian, but yet 131 million people are using it? So clearly there's some utopian, activity that's happening, but the sentiment doesn't feel there.
Yeah, I think there's kind of we're still in a Dr. Dolittle world, right? Where there's things going and push me and pull you, right? So, and Mike, to your point, even the public safety use case, you have to have trust that the people who are doing it, because if you don't, then even the public safety use case requires notice and safeguards and trust in the people who are using this for the right purpose and justification. So, and as that market runs into issues of trust, I think there's also going to be trickle down into the enterprise as well. So there's a very symbiotic relationship across all these use cases, and I think it's moving adoption, comfort, speed, economics all slowly but surely upwards. But things can slip, right? And one bad incident in this world could really have some negative impacts, right? So and there are people who are talking about some of the issues associated with bias and other things here, right? So there's still a fair amount to go through, I think, to get to the fact where, I think 131 million people use it because it's in their hands, right? You just think about whether or not they're actually in control of what's going on. The fact that you have something and you press a button and it does something right away, and you had a choice, I guess, in that process. Whereas in the enterprise use case, you're not quite in the same level of control in terms of what's going on. So that's where I think really the trust in security, the trust in the enterprise itself, and there's some work that needs to be done there, because you can't just say, oh, you're an employee, it's based on your employment contract, you want a paycheck, we're going to do this, right? That's not the way that this will achieve wide adoption. And so that, I don't know that the physical security world is that used to having that conversation with people to engage with them around why they're trusted. It's more about if the door opens, things are fine. If there's a bad person, we need to go deal with them. Trust is not an issue the industry has deep chops in, I would say.
Yeah, so I'll pause on the trust side because I'm going to get to a question. But Mike, I want to make sure I get your view.
Yeah, it brought up something really important for me. So you go to the airport, TSA's got a sign, and if you've opted into biometrics, use this thing. If you haven't, go that way. And I think we're very much an all or nothing industry where you're either in or you're out. And having that differential and having a level of choice. So just as by way of example, someone was asking me the other day about why, where do you think the resistance is going to be in airports going forward? I'm like, you're going to have a small group of people that are like never going to trust the technology, full stop, 100%. So you can't do a 100% dystopian, everybody must do X, because it's just not going to work for a while. But I guarantee, like you go to TSA's website, they've got a whole great webpage. We do this, we don't do this. And the CBP specifically, but and we don't do this. We don't store your stuff. We don't send it off for marketing. They give a really good breakdown of how your data is used and how your data is not used. Now you got to go to the website to find it, and I happen to be a nerd, so I went over there to go find it. It wasn't in the airport. But if you do it in an enterprise, or you do it at a stadium, or you do it at a bank, or whatever like that, and tell people, here's how we're using it, here's how we're not, it helps people condition to understand it. And what I found, at least with like regular humans, not the three of us because we're weird, but the rest of the world, when you explain it just in really basic terms, I'm not storing your picture. It's going to look at you. It's going to match that back to something that you said you were before, and it's going to disappear. Those that are not super paranoid are like, cool, got it, and move on. So
I don't think there's anything more important to success than full-blown useful notice about what's going on, right? And to your point, an option, right? And yeah, opt in, one criticism of the white paper is the opt-in versus opt-out, right? So I'd like to think of things in an opt-in world where basically the workflow is convincing people that they should trust you and that this is a really good thing. As opposed to saying, here, do this, but if you don't want to, it just as a human being, I feel better going that way. And this is one of the interesting things I think about privacy in general. It's a really human way of doing stuff. And I think people, and if you adopt sort of privacy by practice, I think you end up with better systems at the end of the day. And it's not at all at loggerheads with security. And I think that false dichotomy is also something that, for whatever reason, the security industry has somehow thought that, oh, if we have to do privacy, we can't do security. And that's just like really silly because they're very symbiotic.
Yeah, I got to go for hours on that one, so I'll save my opinions on that. But so talk to me about this, because I do think it's important, especially as we get into the conversation of comparing good and bad in a lot of ways, but then even being able to compare good and good. Sal, we talk about trustworthiness, but how do you measure it when it comes to specifically, let's talk about authentication systems? Like, how do we measure this trustworthiness? Like, it can't just be, Sal says so.
No, I love the question. So yeah, there are best practices and ways to measure things, right? So we actually just published some stuff which are called transparency performance indicators that measure how well someone performs the practice of being transparent. I think the way that you measure this stuff is there's three vectors that we find or have found most useful. Transparency being one, reciprocity being the other, and then proportionality being the third, right? So if I know what's going on and I have a way of communicating with whoever's I'm going on with about it, and I'm doing that in a way in which it's fair, where it's not blackmail effectively, then I think you're in a good situation. So those are the things that I would measure: transparency, reciprocity, and proportionality in the application of the technology. And how you measure them, I mean, you can geek out on the standards, ISO 29100, NIST, this cybersecurity frameworks, there are laws that you measure against too, right? So one of the things you need to do is measure against whether or not you're meeting the legal requirements, and that makes privacy an operational requirement, which I don't know that people are that used to, like supporting privacy in their organization, right? And so the extent to which you were able to do that, I think, is another measure. And the way you'll measure that is whether your organization is able to provide that transparency, reciprocity, and proportionality that I was talking about.
Mike, any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the great thing about where the tech is now is you can generate a lot of the data locally. So the bigger concern, again, as a security practitioner hat versus regular person hat, if I had to grab an image, send it for processing, do the processing, return a result, there's multiple points, not just of transit, but of storage and of processing that I've got to now evaluate from a security perspective, right? So I've got to look at this now from what am I doing with the biometric data? Is it associated with PII? What am I doing with the image? Is it associated with both PII, and is it stored in a certain way? There's a lot of different controls that have to be implemented along that path. But now, I mean, like literally now, it's the tech has gotten to a point where you can miniaturize the stuff, make it super cheap, and do point of authentication on a one-to-one basis. So I can bring up, for example, my ID, if it's an ICAO 9303 compliant thing, and some of you will know what that is, some of you will not, and I'd be happy to geek out later. I can extract, as a now switching hat to RealSense person, can extract the biometric from the chip on the card, match your face to what you just showed me on that card, and no data went anywhere. And now it's just like it's you have now demonstrated that that identification belongs to you, and you can do it at point, and you don't have to send it anywhere. So the important thing behind this is that the technology's gotten to a point now where I don't have to do transit, and I don't have to expose data, which means I am kind of by definition GDPR compliant, which then means not by definition, but I start to get more compliant for what exists in the US, which is thin and sparse and weird, but what's here?
What's interesting to me is when I hear about this, it reminds me of the early days of SaaS tools that came out to the market that were selling SaaS. They all had trust websites. Like Salesforce has one, but it was done under the veil of like, you can trust that the service is up. It actually had nothing to do that you can trust the service that they offer. But it does sound to me like there is a need for something within our industry to do that, because like you said, like driving somebody to a third-party website to go read it, pretty hard to go get, the common folk to go do it. You can communicate some things properly there, but also I think getting the ruler stick out that measures it properly, that we can all collectively as a group, especially those that are in the utopian side of all this, can rally around to go do that. I do think is important. All right, so switch gears just a little bit for me on this. When we talk about maturity of the market, Mike, I'm going to kick this to you first. Like, why all of a sudden it does feel like something has shifted where, biometrics were a hard hoe outside of, say, time and attendance in some specific market areas, especially around the world. But like, why all of a sudden do you feel like something has changed that now is the right time to have these conversations, and it's sort of the facial authentication start to go? Like, why? What's happened?
There's probably 3 dimensions I'd look at here. One is the trustworthiness of the tech. It's manufactured by companies with proper intent, and it's done under jurisdictions that are monitoring how it's both implemented and utilized. The second is that the tech is mature enough, like I just talked about a second ago, right? The tech's mature enough now where you can do things that you just couldn't do 5 years ago. And they may have existed, but they were inconvenient. So you could have done some of these technologies 5 years ago, but it would have taken like 10 seconds to get a result. And I don't want to stand there for 10 seconds at an entry gate, just like staring at the ceiling and like thinking about getting to my chair. I want to get in and do whatever thing I'm going to go do, whether that's at work or at a stadium. And the third is around, people have just gotten a lot smarter and a lot more comfortable with what data is. We've gotten a little more lackadaisical as well, right? We're like, okay, cool, I'm going to sign off on, click on acceptable use of data rights. But I think people are actually a lot smarter now about the way that data is being used, and that comfort level translates to comfort level and convenience. Those two things together is like the magic combination for tech acceptance, especially in the way we talk about it. We've historically talked about facial recognition and surveillance like in the same sentence, and that is extremely useful for certain situations, but extremely not useful in the applications that we're talking about, because we're not surveilling people, we're not looking at crowds, we're not looking for bad guys. We just want to make sure you got a plane ticket, right? So changing the nature of the conversation to one-to-one matching, authentication, service, and convenience versus where we were before, people are starting to grok it.
I'll add one more and maybe summarize it. In my opinion, is historically these things have been applied by a third party for value to them, not necessarily the person that was using it, to where now there's value proposition that is still delivering that part. So they're still getting the safety, security, utility that is needed. But there's the plus part where we're now getting into operational efficiencies in addition to that bring value to the person, revenue generation opportunities. So like the ability at stadiums to, buy more beer, frankly, because you can do it easier. And then third one being there's the user experience side of things that is now added to it, to where there's like this holistic sort of like, okay, this makes sense. It's not just, I don't get any value from it, so why am I going to do it? And then like, I'm worried you're going to steal stuff from me, right? Like, to where now it's like, oh, okay, it's good for you, it's good for me, so let's collectively go together and go do it. But then Sal, on top of that, let's move to a sort of a large topic sort of around ethical concerns and regulatory landscape, everyone's favorite topic on that end. But there are still concerns, of course, that we've talked about, the realities people. So if I looked at 2 of them, biases and fairness, right? There's still a big concern. How do you see vendors addressing? Let's talk about the people that are addressing it properly. How do you see them addressing it?
the bias one I like. I shared the acronym with you, right? That a lot. What some of the findings is that the tech is what's known as weird, and it's Western. Yeah, yeah. It's yeah. Oh, sorry. Um, it's Western. It's educated. It's industrialized. It's rich, and it's democratic. If you think about the people who are developing the tech, so as long as we're in a North American market, it's going to be fine. It's interesting how this how the people who are developing the tech sort of bring that, I don't know, combination of characteristics to the table. And so, and those biases do exist, right? I mean, where the technology comes from, it comes from those kinds of places. Now, is that necessarily going to have a negative impact? I don't think it necessarily does, but it's interesting to just be aware of that, right? That that's where this technology is coming from. I think that I think the modeling, right, is still hard, right? And so training these systems and training the models behind the systems, I mean, those are still challenges, certainly. And so the bias piece. The bias piece, I think, is shrinking, but I think it's certainly still there. And if you're not Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, you might feel that bias a little bit more than other people do. So that's just that. That's the bias. And the second one, Lee, I was focused on the bias question. Asking me about. And what was the other?
The one is fairness.
Oh, well, fairness. I think you covered it really well before, right? So what's it doing for me, right? And then listening to Mike, if you're not sharing stuff, boy, you're way ahead of the game, right? So the idea of doing things at the edge and staying, in the equivalent of in the FIPS standard, you have a cryptographic module in which everything is supposed to be really secure, right? The FIPS 140, right? So so the same sort of thing applies. Like when you're dealing with personal identifiable information, I should know about what's going on, and and ideally it's not going anywhere other than for the specific purpose. And this is and so if you can keep that fairness, if I can get as much out of it as you can get out of it, that's the proportionality to piece that I was referring to earlier, Lee, right? It's do I feel in control of what's going on? Do I have any choice? It's fairness as to whether or not a biometric is used. I mean, that's kind of I don't even know that applies in some way, right? I mean, what would be unfair if people couldn't use it, but I think most people do have biometrics, right? And my father was a bricklayer; his fingerprints were never very good, but I think so. I think it's bias is the driver of fairness in many ways.
Okay, I like that. That's it. I like that summary there. But Mike, how do enterprises ensure the other side of this too? So if we move from bias and fairness to transparency and consent, we talked a little bit about it, but just get crisp if you don't mind. Like how do they ensure it?
How do you ensure transparency and consent?
Yeah, and then Sal, hold them accountable. Go ahead.
Yeah, like I gotta say this in front of Sal.
Yep.
So two things. The transparency and consent being two things. On the transparency side, absolute 100% communication and constant. So it's got to come before the request. It's got to come at time of request, and it's got to be a follow-up after request. So super simple, right? It's do it before you do it, then do it after you did it, and tell them what you're doing. And the transparency piece is explicit what it will be used for. And I like talking about this in terms of opt-in versus opt-out. Sal, you got a good call out there, because I want to be able to say, yes, I want you to do this, not no, I don't want you to do this. It's a very different framing of how the security is used. But in terms of the consent piece, it's got to be explicit. I wish to use this service for the following capabilities, or and you got to enumerate what those are. The data can be for, like for the purposes of CBP and TSA, it's to let me not have to bust out my identity and my my boarding pass, and my face is down by boarding pass my identity. And then again, they on the CBP's website, there's a great one pager. It's we do not do this and we do this. Now you got to get to the page to do it. But I think having as an enterprise, when you're signing up for the service in the first place, if you're an employee and you go to your workplace, the workplace they do have the right to do whatever they got to do to make the place secure. But I think it's still important there to have the explicit opt-in and what you're using it for. Now, if the opt-in is not optional, then it's just but then it's a transparency thing. Here's how the data gets used.
Right.
For services though, for like consumer services, then it's got to be at time of sign up, and it can't just be like unclick or click a box. And it can't be a 60-page TNC. It's got to be like 3 bullet points followed by the important legal T's and C's, but it's got to be really clear, crisp English or whatever language of choice, right?
Yeah,
Right.
and could it please not be some dark pattern which puts you to the least privacy preserving solution and most information sharing one? I mean, that's the other thing. It's like the consent theater that many of these pop-ups actually conduct is not helping anybody at the end of the day, right? So that's also part of the challenge, right? And so, yeah, so notice. So can I keep going, Lee? Right. So
yeah.
notice is critical, right? And transparency of the notice results from the timing, and Mike, you got that absolutely right. The content, whether everything that you need is there, and then whether you can access what you need to if you want to do something about it, and then something about a security statement as well to let people know that, you know, we've had an audit, we use these kinds of standards, you know, we've had red teams doing this, you know, something to show people that you've taken, or something that says we're doing edge processing and this never leaves the device, right? So and then with that information in hand, then I can consent to something, and then what I want at that point is actually a record. I want a reverse cookie is what I want at that point, right? Rather than something that you got to track me, what I want is something I have that can track whether or not you're now upholding to what I consented to and the basis for that consent as well. And I think that's one of the challenges here is that everything is pointed at the identification and the tracking of the individual, and there aren't enough tools to provide people with about who they're dealing with and tracking what the people are doing with what they're doing with your information, right? So, and I think as an industry, as we begin to build out some of that functionality, then I think all these other things are going to get better as well, right? Yeah, so a reverse cookie wouldn't be a bad thing.
So Sal, I've written down 2 things that you said so far. The weird acronym is outstanding. I'm going to use that like forever from now on. And the consent theater.
I didn't make it up. It's out there. It's good.
No, I heard it from you. Therefore, you made it up. It's in my head.
Claim it.
But consent theaters, that's awesome because
I like that too.
That one's fantastic because to your point, if I unselect the "Don't Track Me" buttons, those are doing exactly what I really have no idea on the back end. I do them every time, and I'll go cookie by cookie if I have to, but it's insane. There are specific regulations for biometric data handling under GDPR for special considerations for sensitive data.
Sure.
And that includes the broader right to be forgotten. I mean, Sal, you've forgotten more of the stuff than I actually know, so forgive me if I get this wrong. The right to be forgotten, for sure, and also the right to explicitly remove. So if I choose under GDPR, again, we're here in the US, but under GDPR, if I choose to have myself extracted from a service, then I should be able to do so. And like Illinois is probably the furthest out in front of the rest of the country right now in terms of regulation. I think California's got some stuff coming. Texas did a weird thing where they're protecting
the Senate Bill 7.
Yeah. Yep. So there's some, I mean, there's good stuff that's coming, I think, and it's done for largely good intent. What I'm worried about amongst the many things that I get worried about is if someone does this wrong, it's going to set this industry back 10 years. The second I walk into a store that I know I have never opted into because I didn't like have a blackout moment at that store that one day, and they know who I am by looking at my face, then something has been breached. And
I mean,
that's the kind of thing that.
Yeah, no, please,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but yeah.
Oh no,
You just-
that's the kind of thing that it's technically very, 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 very difficult to do. But if you're under like a brand and you go brand to brand underneath like a master company, that's the kind of trust we got to make sure that we're applying. If I'm opting in to a service, I didn't opt into the parent company's parent company's parent company. I opted into that service.
Yeah, no, it's yeah.
Can you?
When you're sitting at home and you're suddenly talking about how boy we need to get some fancier salt, and then the next time you log online you've got this sea salt ad in front of your face, that kind of stuff, it erodes exactly what you're talking about when you've got these cookies that yeah, I mean, I've seen the one I really like was like the silver, gold, platinum, in which platinum you had a choice of which one to take, and platinum, which was most convenience and least privacy enhancing. So like it literally the colors of the buttons, which are grayed in or grayed out. I mean, the whole user interface is a real. And, like you said, you go to the CBP, you see a sign, right? Those people depend on signs to negotiate things in life, right? So are we providing people with the proper signals and signs as they go through this process to make them feel comfortable, right? Imagine driving without, well, in Boston, driving sometimes feels like there are no traffic signs or stop signs or signals, but you wouldn't want a world with that. And I think we need to figure out what those signs need to be a little bit here as well.
Yeah. So, Sal, there's a question, and also I wrote it down here too, so we'll talk about it. But explain a little bit more. Dive into this idea around the reverse cookie idea that you talked about. Can you explain what that means and how that works? And then the question was specifically too, if you could tie to it, is this something like that blockchain can help with?
Okay.
Don't get caught in the blockchain axle first. Why don't
No,
first
I don't.
explain the reverse cookie?
Right. So a reverse cookie basically is, I mean, a cookie captures information about you. It creates an identifier associated with you, and then attributes related to whatever it can acquire. Right. So a reverse cookie would be not an identifier about me, but an identifier about, lack of a better term, the PII controller, the data controller. It's effectively the CEO of the company whose website you're looking at. I don't think he always knows that, but that's where that cookie should be made. And then associated with that are the things that they have then provided you with. So, did they provide notice? Was consent captured? Is there a receipt for that consent? And then have that, and then what policies did I require, I guess, in order for you to be using my personal data? And then can that policy actually be captured in that cookie and act as an enforcement point for any further identification that takes place down the line? And so what you end up with is a credential, not of yours, right? You're not talking about my identity credential, but a credential of the control of someone who's going to be in control of my information. And that credential, in most cases, consists of legally required public information. So it is possible to create a registry of those credentials and for you to use them. Now, you could have your private registry, which could be a distributed ledger, which could be a blockchain. It could be the other technologies too. Or you could have a public one in which people who wanted to promote what a good data controller, PII controller, what a good company you are about this, and have that on a public registry, on a public blockchain. And then if for some reason the nature of the controller and its credential changes, put a new link on the chain. And so, yes, you could, but a registry is a better way, I think. So my having a registry of the people who, in my wallet, having, instead of all these things that allow me to do stuff, have for each one of those things that allow me to do stuff, the paired credential of who I'm doing that with. And if you capture that, if you notarize that, if you digitally sign that, you probably have something that's even legally binding to for the other party. Which there's nothing like something that, when that could improve behavior, right? It just might, right? If the other side knows that you got them on record for what they're allowed to do, and if they go outside of those bounds, there might be some recourse on your part.
Yeah, no, I think there is the need to sort of a scoreboard to guide people. All right, we're coming up close to the end here. We're going to talk one meaty thing. So I'm going to ask you two to sort of just get to the point. But I want to talk about this sort of the regulatory environments of U.S. patchwork versus GDPR in Europe and the difference between them. And we actually have a couple questions that are related to it, like how should enterprises approach evolving privacy laws to avoid playing catch up, especially when the biometric specific legislation is expanding globally. You also have questions in here like the regulatory environment is fragmented in the US but unified under GDPR in Europe. How can multinational enterprises design a single framework for compliance across regions? And there's a couple questions like that. So I know this is a big meaty thing. I'm going to try to get it in like a minute and a half if you guys would. But like, if you could just talk quickly your summary on US's approach and GDPR's approach. And if I'm a business, what should I do? I think if you answered that question, it would probably answer a lot.
You want to start with that one, Sal? You want me to start?
Go ahead, Mike. I'll finish up.
And no pressure. I'll see if I can do 90 seconds on this one.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks for that softball at the end here, Lee. Appreciate it. Wow. So if you are trying to deploy any kind of a service, the natural tendency is going to be to devolve to the lowest common denominator. And that's not a bad idea in a lot of cases. But you can think about biometric data handling. And I'm going to focus on data handling for a second. The process to opt in should be pretty straightforward. The process to opt out should be pretty straightforward. But then the data handling piece of it's really, really important. So think of it as like a waterfall. So I go to a terminal or to my phone, either way, and I say, yes, I want to be part of the service. I click yes. It scans my face. It creates a template. That template goes to somewhere. That somewhere then has an association to my information. So maybe on my phone, I have just my template, nothing else, just template. Maybe at the gate to get into the stadium, my template gets pushed down to it. But that's it. It's the template that says Mike can get into the stadium today. It doesn't say Mike. It just says this template is allowed into the stadium today. It's 1,000 bytes. It's tiny. Somewhere behind that is going to be this template matches this unique identifier, which matches this person. And then behind that's going to be this identifier matches this individual. This individual has the following data. So if you think about it in the context of like financial data and the way that you secure that today. So you're not being willy-nilly with people's banking information. I mean, like I don't have Sal's credit card information stored in some kind of open repo somewhere. It's in a database that is secured with proper controls, policy access controls in front of it, and it's got cryptographic controls behind it. Think of biometric data as another special category of PII. And then everything below that gets really easy to think through. And if you start to adhere to the basics and best practices, there's nothing magical about this, guys. It's just if you apply best practices to the data for biometrics, you're doing the right thing. And as long as you have the deprecation involved to unwaterfall that, to pull Sal out of the database and remove his access rights, and then pull it out with the identifier below that, and then strip it away from all of the different gates that it belongs to that he could now not get into, that's perfectly okay. This isn't legal advice, right? But this is from a technology perspective, it's super straightforward to think of it, a biometric template, to be very similar to a financial record. Just treat them with the care and diligence required that could, that you'd want to treat your financial information.
Sal?
Yeah, you want to go for the high bar, right? I mean, the only way to deal with this melange that exists is really to follow some the standards and best practices that are out there, right? And I mean, Lee, you very well know, like the Maryland law that goes into effect tomorrow, right, is actually more strenuous than GDPR. Yeah, and I don't think anybody actually understands that, right? So you really what you want, and the reason why I say that is that the private right of action in Maryland and the thresholds in Maryland are much lower, right?
Yeah.
So it used to be the case. Well, I'm not 250,000 people in my company, not a data it doesn't matter what you're holding personally identifiable information for as well, right? So I really do think that if you look at this from, if you take privacy best practice and you use it to make security best practice, you're going to end up with a trusted service, which is going to make people happy and meet your business objectives. And it is not expensive. Probably is less expensive than the legal expense that you're currently expending on this stuff, quite frankly. And that you want to look at it. We have an acronym we refer to as BOLTS, right? So you want to look at across business, business, operational, legal, technical, and social factors, right? And so when you're solving these problems, you want to make sure for the BOLTS, it's working, right? So if you take best practice and see if it meets bolts, you're probably going to be good. And I would, get over the bar, don't limbo, pull volt.
I got to tell you that bolts, I wrote that down, the consent theater, also the Dr. Doolittle part at the beginning. I like too. So this has been wonderful. There's a ton of questions that have come through. What we're going to do is we're going to gather those, and actually we will respond through written to everybody so that we can make sure that we answer what everybody had here. But we want to be mindful of your time. So I want to thank you, Sal. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, RealSense. Thank you, everyone who's been here that has spent the time to go do this. Please go ahead and check out that white paper that we had. There will be a QR code where you can download it. And you can go to realsenseai.com as well, and you'll find it there. Thank you. I appreciate you all participating, and we will follow up with the answers to the questions that you have, and maybe we'll do another one of these. It's the beginning of a larger conversation that clearly needs to be had. So thank you.
That was great. Thanks, guys. Yeah, any of these topics can be an hour long. Just a single question on here can be an hour long.
All right, guys. Thank you very much. Appreciate everyone joining.
Happy trails, folks. Thank you.